You are here to learn about integrated pipelines with private and public clouds using CloudBees Jenkins, Artifactory, and Pivotal Cloud Foundry. You are in the right place. I am Jamie O'Mara. I'm the guy that will be taking 45 minutes of your day today, hopefully to not only entertain you, but to enlighten you about building pipelines. Just a little bit about myself. I work for Pivotal, so I've been there since the start for about 3 years now. But my primary focus is a CloudFoundry enthusiast, as well as a very specialized in helping customers look at using PaaS for things like continuous delivery and deployment. Prior to that, I have about 20 years of software engineering experience, and this is my Twitter handle. And so one of the things that I like to do at conferences is also provide a unique fact about myself, so that way if you think that the presentation wasn't very good and you happen to be walking down the hall and you see me, we have something else to talk about. So fortunately for me, last week I was in Maui on a vacation with my family, and I was able to knock off a couple of bucket list items. When I did a little cliff diving in Maui, it was not 40 or 50 feet tall. I can tell you right now it was only about 20 feet, but it was a lot of fun. And then for the first time in my life, I did surfing. So I've been a snowboarder, but I was able to actually do some surfing. And this picture here, which you may not be able to see real well, does prove it, and I am that one guy that's standing right there in the black shirt. So it was a lot of fun. If you ever get a chance to do it, I would highly recommend it. So one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you guys about today is that I feel that the software development industry is kind of entering into a new era. And that era is placing a lot of emphasis on the software delivery process and delivering things faster. So if you look at the companies that are listed on here, as has been mentioned earlier, these are the unicorns of the industry. Although I don't necessarily always agree with that terminology, because I think these are the models that we want to set ourselves to. But if you look at these companies have been very disruptive in their industry for a lot of different reasons. But I think what you'll notice about them is they all have one thing in common, and that is they have very active software delivery cycles, and they're able to deliver very frequently. Now, if you actually take a look at some of the examples here, for example, Square and Airbnb, these have both released their software this year 9 and 12 times respectively from the iOS application perspective. 9 to 12 releases per year so far to date. Another one of the companies that is very disruptive in this is Uber. And I don't know if you guys use Uber a lot, but I do. This was actually a marketing blitz that I received from Uber within the last couple of weeks. And in 2013, some 450,000 users were actively using Uber and launching the app every week. And based on this marketing blitz, what I did is I kind of went back and started to look at my usages of Uber. And the one thing that I noticed was the impact it actually had on my business travel. So in the 22 months that I've been there, I've had 40 transactions with them with an average fare price of about $47, which equated to about $1,900 in business that I've done with Uber. Now, one of the things that I noticed and the behavior I noticed about Uber was their ability to also deliver software. So in the last 2 months, I've noticed that their iOS application has been released 8 times in 2 months. Now, all of these examples I've given you to date have been on the client side of iOS applications, but if you start to think about that, there's a lot of coordination that has to happen with back-end systems too. And so we need solutions to kind of bring this together to make the delivery of the front end and the back end systems together. Now, I get asked this question just about by every customer is, how do these kind of companies do that? How do we become more Uber-like in our philosophy? And I think it's very important to remember that these companies didn't necessarily start out that way, but what they did is they built culture around change. And even when I watch Pivotal go through this is Pivotal Labs. I don't know if anybody's really familiar with them, but this is a company that's been around for 25 years, but they've really perfected this whole concept, and they've built it into their culture. So when you look at, for example, when I look at CloudFoundry, I mean, the amount of releases that we do for CloudFoundry to the open source community, I'm actually really floored at how frequently we actually release software. And we do build a continuous pipeline and delivery mechanism for it. But I think the other thing that's important to realize about these companies is they looked differently at the way the delivery of that software into production, right? They took a different mentality to it with using more experimental releases, using things like A/B testing, where they really blurred the lines between what used to be considered beta and production and really allowed customers to drive that, the behavior of using that and to understand whether it was effective or not. And I think the other thing that you'll notice, and I've seen with these companies and as a trend, is that they question what production deployment is. When I used to do production deployments, it was a very stressful time for us. People were really freaked out. It was always done on the weekend. They've really blurred the lines with that, and you'll see as we go further why they were able to do that. And this was using some of the cloud-based technologies. Now, of course, be able to have culture and to be able to push things in like that, you need to have a very communicative process back. And so you have to have very good feedback loops and information coming back, as well as metrics, which we saw in the keynote next door. It was very true for a lot of these companies, is they had these metrics built in to the delivery of the software and that feedback loop. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. About a year and a half ago, Instagram had released a new UI for their users. And I had noticed within a 24-hour period, they had rolled that back to the old UI. And what they found was that over the course of that 24 hours, as the new UI went out, nobody liked it. They stopped using the service. And that really made them, normally, typically, you would have panicked or not understood what was going on, but they had the metrics and feedback loops in place that they realized that it was that software that was causing the issue. They rolled it back, and within 24 hours, people were back to using it. And of course, if you have culture and you have the communicative process around this, then you need the technology and the tools. And this is kind of where the things like Jenkins and Cloud Foundry and Artifactory can really come in to make that delivery much easier going forward. Now, one of the things that I've felt privileged in having 20 years of experience in software engineering is you gain a little different perspective when you look back over the years of building software. And one of the things that I think that we've always done, always strived to do, is build better quality software. And that really started back in the 90s when the Gang of Four book came out, and you saw us look at the way that we structured our code, and we said, well, we need to go to something more object-oriented where we would get encapsulation and we would change the structure of our code to make it better. As we continued to go through that process, we said, well, that's great. Now we have better structure, but how do I actually know that it's working? Where's that level of confidence that I have? And that's where you started to see things like functional tests and unit tests and UI tests and integration tests really come into play. And then we really started to change our mindset and think about that and said, well, if we're going to write these tests, maybe we should write the test first or figure out how to write the test first, then we'll go write the code. And then eventually continuous integration became part of that as well. So that way, whatever we were building, we knew at the end of the build, we were very confident in what was built. Now, I think with continuous deployment and continuous delivery, we're ushering in a new set of standards to do the exact same thing that we did in the build phase to the delivery phase. And I think it's very important. Now, I feel, and I actually had validation by just going to the keynote, is that no matter what we build, it's where we deliver it to that matters. And when we deliver it, we should feel, if we're delivering it to AWS today, we should still have that same level of confidence that when we deliver it on site, that it's not going to take a 9-month conversion process to go through that. I also noticed, and I also agree with some of the comments that were made earlier, is that configuration management's really changing too. It's really coming into the source control management, and it's really being a bigger part of the process, right? It used to be days where you just stuff something in a properties file and you'd have a black box deployment and you'd push your code out there and you'd kind of walk away. And I really think that those days are pretty much gone. I think what's also going to deliver a higher set of value are some of the patterns that are being established, things like the blue-green deployments, and really questioning what a production deployment is today. So I think it's almost fundamental, if we're going to do continuous deployment, continuous delivery, that we start with platform as a service, because platform as a service is almost the key to being that endpoint as to where we deliver. And I think there's 4 key elements that we need to really look at when we look at platform as a service. One, I think that we need a very strong, vibrant, open source community to lay the foundation for our platform as a service. For us, CloudFoundry is the top most open source community for platform as a service today. I think the second thing is, whichever platform you choose, it really needs to abstract away the underlying cloud provider and make that platform portable. And I think what I've seen with a lot of customers to date that have gone down the AWS route, I mean, today there's 4 different ways to deploy code on AWS, but only AWS. When you start to build these technologies and these solutions, you want to have more than just a single vendor API. And so we start to, I think, having something like CloudFoundry provide that level of portability across IaaS providers is very important. I also think high availability and scalability of the platform is as important as well as the applications. If you look at the applications that are built today, Uber's a good example. If they had relied on the old ways of engineering things where we put things on boxes or even just virtualized it to a VM, they would have never been able to scale to the type of numbers that they needed to. So that platform should have that kind of level of engineering already built into it. And then from a developer's perspective, I think that the solution has to be able to support where I am today and where I want to go in the future, so the different frameworks and the tools and the technologies, as well as be very API-centric. So as a developer, I like to, my most comfortable level is looking and interacting with APIs. So beyond evaluation of the platform, I think there's also 9 key characteristics that you might want to look for in terms of the value of the platform, what else it provides. So this is really, there's benefits in a platform for both operators and developers. From an operational perspective, you want to be able to have that abstraction and you want to be able to use that platform to be able to provision and configure the platform itself. So spin things up, spin things down, add more capacity. From a developer's perspective, you start to move into things like containerization. So the platform should support any number of containerizations. Today, the most popular containerization obviously is Docker. You all have heard of it. But Rocket is gaining some popularity. The build packs from Heroku were also very popular with people. So having different types of containerization, I think, is very critical to the platform. Load balancing and routing across those different instances is very important, and we'll see a little bit more of that coming up during the demonstration. And I think any platform that you look at should have health management built into it. So how well is my applications performing, or how well are my applications? Are they available? Are they not available? Do I need to spin new ones up? I think it's also important that that the platform be able to self-heal itself. So if a major component of the platform goes down, who brings it back up, right? That has to be part of the platform. Scaling, I mentioned. Services, which are the building block for developers. These are the things like the highly available database that you want to use or the messaging bus that you want to use. These are the services that we connect to when we push our application into the platform, and those also have to be a major consideration for your platform needs. And then log aggregation and metrics. If you can imagine the number of instances of an application that Uber has to support from a back-end system, scaling that up and then aggregating all of that log information and analyzing it, that needs to be part of your platform. That should be pretty much right out of the box. Security and role management are always critical aspects of the platform itself as well. Now, one of the things that I happen to notice, a pattern that's kind of evolved, and Martin Fowler talked about it on one of his blog posts, it's probably almost 7 years old now, was that of the blue-green deployment. And for us within CloudFoundry, blue-green deployment is just built into the platform. It's just part of the 9 value-added features that you have there. But what's important here, and this is why we can start to think about production in a different way, is that we can actually stand up the application, the current version and the next version side by side and route traffic differently to it based on the requests coming in. So here in the blue-green deployment, in box 1, we have the initial deployment that we have there, and you can see the URL that's being pointed to within the platform. Now the new version is coming out, which is the green here in box 2, and we assign it a different URL at deployment time. We keep the existing external URL for the outside world back to the blue one. And then in box 3, what we do is we start to slowly transition people to the green version and let them complete their transactions on the old one and slowly migrate to the new one. And in the 4th one, we have all the traffic going to the new green one. Now, if it was me and I was looking at a best practice, I would probably keep 2 or 3 of the older versions around, so that way I can always roll back as far as I want. So this diagram doesn't really show that, but that's kind of the idea of blue-green deployments. And I think the benefit here is it really reduces the risk of a bad deployment. So when you have a bad deployment, it isn't everybody coming in on the weekend to roll back. It's just really switching it back over to the previous one. Okay, so I wanted to walk you through real quickly. We're going to go ahead and do a demonstration right after this, but I kind of just wanted to walk you through the demonstration flow and what I've set up, so that way you have some context as to what you're about to view in the video. So I have a simple application. It's called Map Application. It's a mapping application. It just shows the United States and a couple of orders that are coming into each state. The application itself is not really significant. It's really the process that I go through to not only add a new feature, but to get that deployed and then promoted up into a production system. So in this example, what I have is I have a private instance of CloudFoundry running in my own data center, and then I also am using a public instance of CloudFoundry called Pivotal Web Services, which is actually running on top of AWS. So I have the ability to move or deploy my application to basically AWS and on-prem using CloudFoundry as my basis to deliver the application. All of my code actually resides in GitHub, so what I'm going to do, and you'll see in the videos, I'm going to make a change for a new feature request that's been requested through the community, and it's going to add that to the application. I'm going to test it locally, and then I'm going to push that into GitHub. Jenkins, which has been deployed on my on-premise through CloudFoundry, is going to pick up that change. It's going to have it has 5 jobs. It has one that'll just build the artifact, do all the testing, the continuous integration, and basically my quality check at the build phase. The next 2 jobs downstream jobs from that, one will push the application to the on-premise version, and the other will push the application to the Pivotal Web Services or the hybrid public version. And then I have 2 other jobs beyond that when we're ready to promote into production, you'll see where we actually come in and we select the version that we want to promote. You'll see we'll go through that process as well. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with our demonstration. All right, so here we have the deployed map application as it exists. What you're going to see here is when we come in, this is the developer console. In the center of that box was map 56. Yes?
So you might have different components of your application, right?
Correct.
It's not only the front-end UI, but you might have a back-end database, and you might have a middleware, right?
Yep.
So for this particular deployment to work, are you suggesting that for every component that you have in the application, we maintain 2 versions?
Yes, you would maintain 2 versions. Well, it depends on the dependencies between each of the different pieces, but there might be a chance that you would have different dependencies, because as you take your application and you start to break it into different pieces, and if you start going down a microservice architecture, then it's understanding the dependencies between the different pieces. But there is a chance that if, let's say, you had 10 different services, that you may actually end up having, through the deployment, 20 total instances of that application, the previous version and the next version.
So for all of the components which make up an application, you maintain multiple versions in production?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, so is that any better? Can you see that?
Much better.
All right, let's get started then. All right, so we have the deployed map application. This is the developer console, so you can see here we have version 56 in place. If I actually go into the application, I can see that it's running. I can see that the routes that are available for the application, and I'll explain the route in a minute. Here is the log output from that application from a developer's perspective.
Can you also speak to which tool we are in right now when you're showing?
Sorry, I tried to pause that. All right, say that one more time.
No, we just want to know, while you're showing the demo,
Mm-hmm.
which tool we are while we are going through.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
So I think we are using, while showing the demo, right, you are traveling through different tools, right? you're using Git for version control, Jenkins for continuous integration.
Yes. So I haven't done any deployment. I'm just showing you the current version.
So what is this particular tool?
This here is Pivotal Cloud Foundry. So this is a developer console version of the developer Cloud Foundry. So this is the endpoint where I push my application to.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So in doing so, and that's a good point, in doing so, Cloud Foundry will basically take that application and stand up all of the components that are required for that application to run. And so the previous one that I was showing was the on-prem. This Pivotal Web Services in the upper left corner is the public version of the application. This is actually running on top of AWS. And what I really want to get across to you is that when you use something like Cloud Foundry, it doesn't matter who your cloud provider is, because the way that you deploy and how you interact with it is the exact same. So when you want to move things back and forth, you can easily do that. So in this example here, this is what the application looks like. I'm going to go ahead and start streaming the orders for this particular application, and I will zoom in for the on-premise version, and we can kind of take a look at the orders that are coming in. I could tell it's the on-premise version because if I look at the URL, it has a different domain name. Now I look at the URL for the public version, and it has a different domain name. So you could abstract the actual name that you apply to it to a higher level global load balancer and hide all of this complexity, obviously, for a user, but it gives you the capability to do that. Now I've been asked by my management to deliver a new feature. So here I am in my local IDE where I'm going to do the development of this application. I'm going to come in here and add a new feature, which is a new button to the application. So some kind of visual context just so that we can see the new feature. I will save it here locally, let it recompile, and then I will test it to make sure that I feel very confident that this is the right thing I need to do. So on the upper right-hand side, you can see I have a new button called the Awesome button. Once I feel very confident with that, I'm ready to check this in to to Git, so that it's part of my source control, much like we've talked about in earlier components. So here we'll just do the quick add and then offer the commits and the message that goes with the commit as well. And then finally, we'll just do a git push. So this will put this into source control for me. Now we start the continuous delivery process. And so this is where we used the on-premise Jenkins to be able to do this. So I have a project out there called PCF map. And all of this is doing here was it noticed that there was changes into GitHub. So you notice out on the left-hand side here. It picked up those changes, and it's starting to build the artifact through the build phase. From there, I have two downstream projects that will actually do the delivery, I'm sorry, not the delivery, but the deployment into CloudFoundry. And I will take you guys through this in just a minute so you have a good feel for what that looks like. So at the completion of the build phase, the delivery phase kicked in. If I go back into CloudFoundry to look at the application, because I didn't do a blue-green deployment for development, you could see that the route didn't exist, and so it couldn't lead me to the application. Still doesn't exist yet, but it's going through the process of creating the next instance. So you can see here, if I go, now I have build 57 coming online in both the private and now the public. So here's 57 there for the public. If I go back and look and step into the application, this is it being actually deployed inside of CloudFoundry. I can see it's still starting. I have mapped a canonical route name to it so that developers can easily get to it. I could look through the logs, and then I can bind to the services that the application uses. In the public cloud, I have the exact same thing, nothing different. Here, I don't have a status yet, but you can see that I've mapped the new routes, or mapped the new route over. It's going through the process of creating that container for me with the application inside of it, and it has the services that are bound to it. So 2 different clouds, 2 different versions, same process. That's one of the things that I think is very important to understand. Now that it's started, if I go back, you can see that this application is now running with the new feature that I have available. I'll also check the public version of this, and it's running as well. So if I go there and now I refresh, I now have the new version running in the public cloud too. So now I've deployed to AWS, I've deployed on-prem, nothing's been any different. We'll go ahead and start that process up. We'll do a quick check just to make sure that the orders are coming through. Everything looks good. Okay. Now we jump into Artifactory. I just want to look at what was actually put into Artifactory. So in this case, I had version 57, which I just built. I put my deployment artifacts in there. And then within Artifactory, I have some metadata as to what was actually placed in Artifactory. So I can look at things that are important, like the build version number, any hash commits, that kind of stuff. So I can actually trace all of this back to the original Git request that was put in when I did the Git push. Now it's time to actually promote this into a production environment. So I have the original jobs there. The first thing I need to do is go back to the deployment artifact that I created, and I want to go through and use the integration between Jenkins and Artifactory to promote it. So I select a target partition for that to be moved to, a repository. I create a copy of it, and then Jenkins, in interacting with Artifactory, will actually make that promotion occur. If I switch back over to Artifactory, I can come in here and I can actually see that that occurred. It moved it to my external resource release local, and I now have a version 57 in my snapshots and a version 57 in my release. So now I know exactly which version was released into production, and then I can look at the same set of information. Now, what I want to be able to do is move it into production. So the current version that's out there is build 41, and it's running. It has 2 instances running. You can see the routes that are associated to it. I have a very easily identifiable external route to it called maps, and I have the exact same thing on the production side on my public cloud. So it has 2 instances running. I'm going to take a look at the routes. You can see that I have both routes associated to it. And this is the application prior to the new deployment, so we'll start that up and get it running. And then the same thing for the public cloud. So we can see that the orders are flowing for it. And then with our next step will to actually start the promotion process. So to do that, I had 2 jobs that were sitting out there, and I want to actually build this with parameters, and I want to tell it which version I want to push. So in this case, I want to push version 57, and so I start that process of pushing the application to the private cloud as well as the public cloud now, and I want to do the exact same version. You can see that the space and the domain, the spaces are the same, but the domain names were different. And the domain names are used to create that mapping for the route. So we'll see that in a little more detail here. So if I click back over and I look into CloudFoundry as we're getting ready to do the deployment or the delivery of this application, you can see 41 and 57 are being created side by side. The same thing will happen here in the public cloud where we have 41 and 57 created side by side. So if we jump in to 57, we'll see it's going through the process of creating this instance. So we haven't mapped the route yet, so we have an internal route that we use that we can test against and verify if we want to before we switch over. And then we have the exact same thing on the public side. So we haven't mapped the route. The logs are starting up. You can see that it's going through the process of creating the container for us. And then it'll take just a second here. All right, it should be coming here just a second. All right, so what you'll notice now is we have 57 running in both the public and the private cloud. And at this point, we have mapped over the route so that new traffic is being directed on both of those to the external URL. And now if we go back into our application and refresh, what you'll notice is that the new button is there and the application is proceeding forward by taking the orders here. So that happens on both the public and the private side. The button is there for both. And now we have completed a software promotion of our application. Okay, so what I'd like to do is show you real quick. So this is the actual environment live. So these were the jobs that we just went through and looked at. So I had these 5 here. So PCF map was the one that created the artifacts, and then I did deployments, and then I did software promotion. From a operations perspective, I think what's always interesting to see is how does the operator see Pivotal Cloud Foundry? And this is how they see it. They see it as a bunch of tiles that get deployed for it. But what I wanted to show you, and what I think is very fascinating, is if you're looking at doing something like CloudFoundry and you incorporate Jenkins on here, most organizations, if they may already have a Jenkins in place, but if you don't, or if you're looking to create more of a cloud scale Jenkins, Ops Manager is really good at doing that for you. So what you typically will do from an installation perspective is you'll come in here and you'll provide configuration for this. And one of the things that you'll end up doing is creating a slave and a number of masters and slave combinations here. So in my environment, I have one slave, and I have I have one master and 3 slaves in this case. And those were actually created by going through this process here of me installing it and standing it up. So from an operator's perspective, it was really easy for me to do. When I was done doing this, it was very easy for users then to come in and start consuming it. They could come in and start creating their application or their Jenkins jobs configurations right here. Okay. So some of the things that I had learned through this process and some of the best practices from CloudFoundry specifically. The first one is not necessarily 100% that you need to use this. There are community-driven plugins. I just found that the CloudBees Jenkins one seemed to work really well, where I had some issues with some of the other ones. But some of the other lessons learned were around hash commits and build numbers, using that for versioning number and understanding. That way, when you looked at specific artifacts that were deployed within CloudFoundry, I could relate that back to a specific commit that occurred all the way back in Git. Canonical route names for ease of use and external access. I get asked this question quite a bit from customers that are looking to use things like blue-green deployments and just using techniques around the routing. The way I describe it to them is you always have your external-facing URLs that you provide, and then you have your internal ones. And finding and using canonical route names makes it very easy. So if you were to look back at my example, when I was in development looking at things, or if I was in Q&A or test, my URL for that would always be map.test. Whatever the rest of the URL was. So that way, whoever was using it could go to the latest and greatest without having to worry about the build number. As I had mentioned previously, I do see software configuration management and configuration details, environment variables, all of that moving into the SCM world. And we have a lot of customers that are, as they're looking to migrate their applications in the CloudFoundry, are definitely looking to do this. And then I definitely think from a lessons learned and a best practice for continuous delivery, any design that you include should have multi-cloud for portability and scale. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to in the last year that built or acquired a company that did everything on AWS, and then the application really took off for them, going into the millions, and they wanted to pull it back in-house. And the cost for them to do that, or to get off of AWS, it was a 9-month cycle just to get all of their tooling redone and moved back to be on-prem. So, some future designs and topics that I would recommend, some other things that I evaluated. I did look at the Jenkins workflows capabilities for this. I actually went down that path for about a week, And I chose to go back to using kind of the out-of-the-box stuff that was there today. I think Workflows definitely has a good fit, and it's the right direction for the Jenkins community and where they're going, specifically around things like checkpoints. One of the other questions, and I think someone kind of asked this, was the orchestration around microservices. That's another topic that I plan to cover in a little more detail. Since Docker images seem to be the way that a lot of people are going, another area that I would really like to get into is using Docker images on CloudFoundry Diego, which is the next release of CloudFoundry. A high-scale on-premise cloud deployment using Jenkins on CloudFoundry. So I showed you guys the Ops Manager and how easy that is to kind of set up. What I'd like to do is kind of take that a little further and do more of a large-scale deployment for what the enterprise would really need. And then as an alternative to blue-green deployment, there's something called the Autopilot. And this is what we call a CF plugin. And if this is something that you might be interested in, you can find that under plugins on cloudfoundry.org. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you guys, and then we can do a few question and answers, is I did create all of this documentation for everything that you saw here today is actually in my GitHub account under app pipeline. So it has all the instructions on how to do this and set this up yourself. And the best part is if you want to use Pivotal Web Services to do that, that's a free service that anybody can use. You can go up, create an account, and you can start going through this process yourself if you're interested in doing that. So with that, I would like to thank you guys for coming out, and I'll take any questions you have.
You showed how your Jenkins CI build automatically did a deploy, but presumably if you checked in bad code, that would not get deployed, right? The bad build, you would sort of bail out and say,
Right. Yeah, so if it failed during the PCF map job, then it wouldn't have done the downstream jobs.
Good.
Yep.
Another question is, you're using GitHub for your source code repository?
I was, yes.
But there's really no need to do that, right? You could just set up a Git server in your private
Absolutely.
cloud. Okay.
Yeah. I have the fortunate to be able to use the GitHub but obviously working in a lot of different enterprises, they're not all using GitHub. So, but yeah, any Git server would work, and you can, actually any of the other source control management systems would work with this as well. So.
Does that documentation show how to set up your own private cloud, or is that another kind of process?
So that documentation doesn't show how to do that. But there's a whole set of documents for that. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm curious.
Yeah, keep them going. I love questions.
Yeah. You talk a lot about the routing and changing one route to the next. Is that by playing tricks with DNS, or do you establish your DNS from the get-go, and then you don't have to mess with the DNS afterwards, or do you really have to get down and dirty with name servers?
No, so that's the best part, and I'm glad you brought that up. So if you think back to the slide that had the 9 bullets on it, one of them was load balancing and routing. And so when you go to set up an on-premise version of CloudFoundry, it has a wildcard DNS that then forwards all the requests internal to what we call the routing layer, and that's where all of that is actually happening. So it's actually automated as part of the push, is it'll actually update the routing tables when you push a new application in, and as long as your route's unique, it knows how to get to it.
And that scales okay?
It scales perfectly, yep. We do about 7,000, we have 7,000, so that Pivotal Web Services has about 7,000 applications running in it today, and we use the same routing. I think there's only about 4 routing VMs that support that. All right, well, thank you for coming, I appreciate it.